In this video, we're going to show you to install the lower control arm on your INFINITI G37 X, located behind your front wheels. Using a 21mm socket, loosen and remove your lug nuts. Now on our particular vehicle, we have a locking lug nut. We have the key to remove it. If you just have a standard lug nut, go ahead and take it off. Once you have those removed, remove the wheel and set it aside. We're going to go ahead and remove our axle nut. Now on your particular vehicle, you may have a cotter pin running through the axle nut that keeps that nut from coming off. Go ahead and remove that cotter pin and remove your axle nut. We're using a 36mm socket. Go ahead and set that aside. On our knuckle here, we have a flex hose to a hard line with a junction right here, as well as on the back side, it's the same setup. 12mm nuts. We want to go ahead and loosen and remove both of these. I'm just going to go ahead and pry this out a little bit. And then work this off of the back side. We want to separate our ABS wire from our strut and knuckle assembly. You're going to gently grab the rubber portion, not the wire, and slide that out. Now there's 3 points of contact here on the front side, and if you follow it around the back side, there's a 4th contact right on the back of the knuckle. Go ahead and grab that wheel assembly, rotate that. And we now want to go ahead and pull out our ABS sensor from the back side of the knuckle. Use a 10mm socket. Loosen and remove the ABS bolt. Go ahead, grab that and twist it gently and slide that out. Let's disconnect our outer tie rod end here. You want to go ahead and remove the cotter pin. You use a pair of cutters or pliers, and you want to bend out this little tab right here. Now if yours happen to have 2 tabs, go ahead and straighten them out. Cotter pins are a one-time use, so you're definitely going to want to source a replacement cotter pin for this. And then grab the other side. Go ahead and work that out. There it is. Go ahead and dispose of that cotter pin. Now we're going to use an 18mm socket to remove our nut here. Yours might be a little bit different. Use the appropriate socket to loosen and remove the nut. Now you can use a hammer and lightly strike here while applying some downward pressure. Loosen and remove the 12mm nut holding our 3rd flex hose union here. Slide that off. Go ahead and rotate this over. On the back side of our knuckle here, we have 2 22mm bolts holding our caliper and caliper bracket. We're going to start by loosening and removing the lower one first. Now, when we go ahead and remove the upper one, the caliper and bracket will be loose, so you want to be careful. You want to hold on to that once you get ready to remove that bolt completely. Go ahead and remove that bolt and washer. The next thing you want to do is you want to grab a support tool, something like this here, and you're going to slide the caliper and bracket off. And you're going to bring that caliper up and hang that. Let's go ahead and grab your brake rotor, slide that off and set that aside. On the upper ball joint here, we have our pinch bolt, 14mm socket. Go ahead and remove that nut. We're gonna leave the bolt in for now. On our bottom ball joint coming through our knuckle, we have a nut here with a cotter pin. We can use our pliers or cutters. We wanna go ahead and straighten out the tabs and remove this cotter pin here. Now, cotter pins are a one-time use. So be prepared to go ahead and source a replacement cotter pin. Sometimes these get stuck. Do your best to try and work this out. Ours is stuck in there pretty good, so we're just gonna nip that off. Snip off as much as you can. We're gonna put our socket on here and we're gonna zip that right past. Using a 22mm socket, go ahead and loosen and remove the lower nut. Using our 18mm socket, we're going to loosen and remove the nut for our sway bar end link. At this point here, I'm gonna raise up on our knuckle a little bit, pull this bolt out. Work that out. Now down below, we're going to work our CV axle out. And then off of the ball joint and set the knuckle aside. Using a 14mm socket, go ahead, loosen and remove the clevis fork bolt. Use a 17mm wrench on the bolt head and 17 on the nut. Now I'm going to put a pry bar on the top of the control arm and on the chassis and push down. That's going to allow us to work this bolt out of the clevis fork. Use your pry bar between the sway bar and the lower control arm. Go ahead and work that so you can get that sway bar disconnected from the control arm. Like so. Just swing that out of the way. For the rear portion of our control arm, we have the junction right here. There's going to be two 19mm bolts that go in horizontally. Loosen and remove these. On the back portion of our control arm, we have two vertical bolts that go up into the rear portion of the control arm. In order to gain access to this here, we need to remove the bolt right here. Normally you're gonna have a 10mm bolt. Ours is missing, but it was replaced with an 8mm. Loosen and remove this. Should be able to flex this down and get your socket onto this here. Now you definitely want to go ahead and spray this down with some rust penetrant to help break any corrosion. Using a 14mm socket, let's go ahead and loosen and remove these bolts. On the front portion of our control arm, we have a 19mm bolt here that comes through to a captured nut on the other side. Using a swivel head socket and our impact, we want to loosen and remove this. Got to remove that bolt. Using a securing strap, we're going to anchor our axle up. Now our clevis fork itself is unbolted. It is free from our strut and free from the lower control arm. Now we're going to use our pry bar. We're going to come into the front portion and we want to pry this down. As this comes down, the clevis fork can fall off. So you want to be careful with this here. Make sure that you're keeping this axle secured. Now on our backside here, our control arm is hitting our inner rack boot. So we're going to go to the other wheel. We're going to crank that to try and get that moved out of the way. Drop that axle a little bit, pull down on that control arm. Slide that clevis fork out. Let's take our control arm and between our frame and the control arm, we're going to pry it outward. Get that free. Now you want to go ahead and wiggle the control arm, maybe flex it up and down a little bit to get the block out of the rear portion of the frame. You can use your pry bar to assist in getting behind the upper portion and pulling this down. Go ahead and get that control arm up into place. Now getting our control arm up here. Use your mallet, a rubber mallet, to go ahead and pop that up into the frame. You can slide the front portion up. Now on our original control arm, on either side of the bushing here, there were these rubber sleeves. So we do want to go ahead and slide those back into position. They just slip right over the ends, like so. Use your rubber mallet to tap that up. And we'll get in position this and get our bolt through and started. Now I'm not going to tighten this, I just want to run that bolt in. Let's go ahead and transition to the rear bolts. We're going to install our two lower bolts here. Just going to get these started. I'm going to thread them in as far as I can by hand, but I'm not going to tighten them yet. Still want to go ahead and install the 2 horizontal bolts. We can now go ahead and remove our securing strap for our CV axle. Use our pry bar between the control arm and the frame. Just put this flex hose up. I'm going to throw it up here to get it out of the way. Now that we have the clevis fork onto our strut and everything's lined up here, we install our bolt here. Now before we tighten this, you do want to make sure that the clevis fork itself is tight up against this stop right here, that there's no gap. If there's a gap here, you need to pry up on your clevis fork or lift up on it and then tighten this down. Torque that down to 33 foot-pounds. Going to install our lower bolt here. Install the nut on the back side. On the lower control arm here, I want to go ahead and pop off the cap protecting the lower ball joint. Now what we want to do is pop off this cone-shaped wedge right here. This is going to come off the factory lower ball joint and get swapped over onto the new ball joint. And you can see it popped right off, so we're going to go ahead and swap this over to the new ball joint stud. Now that we remove the cap, go ahead and slide our wedge on. Insert the lower ball joint and the axle into the hub. Then we'll bring the upper control arm down into the knuckle. And get that bolt started in here. Just let it set. This is pretty much going to hold everything together. Let's go ahead and thread our axle nut on. Let's go ahead and put the nut on the lower ball joint. On the lower ball joint nut, you're going to notice that there is a hole here. That is for your cotter pin. Install the castle nut. Let's go ahead and tighten that down using a 22mm socket. Go ahead and torque this down to 100 foot-pounds. Now at this point, you want to watch for the hole in the ball joint and make sure that one of the notches in the castle nut lines up with the hole. Now if it doesn't line up after you torqued it, continue to tighten the nut until the next notch lines up. Never loosen the nut to get this to line up. So tighten it a little bit more if you need to. Go ahead and take your cotter pin, slide that through. You want to bend over this tab. Use your cutters to snip off the excess. We're using our pull jack underneath our control arm. We're going to raise up our suspension. this installed, let's install the nut on the other side. Go ahead and torque this down to 46 foot-pounds. Now our next step is crucial. We're using our jack underneath the control arm. What we're doing is we're compressing our suspension into a neutral ride height, meaning if we had the wheels on the car and the car was on the ground, using the body weight to compress the suspension, that would be its neutral ride height. So we want our neutral ride height when we torque down our lower clevis bolt, as well as all of our control arm bolts. So let's go ahead and compress this where it needs to be. I'm going to tighten this down first. Now we're going to torque this to 120 foot-pounds. Tighten down our 2 vertical bolts here. And then we'll torque them to 70 foot-pounds. Install your lower splash shield bolt. You'll probably have that 10 millimeter. Go ahead and install that now. Snug that down. We'll bottom out our forward mounted bolt. Now we need to torque this to 118 foot-pounds. With those bottomed out, let's go ahead and torque those to 128 foot-pounds. Now that we have our control arm fully torqued and our lower clevis fork bolt torqued, we can remove our jack, let that suspension drop. I'm going to grab the wheel on the other side and turn this to go ahead and move that tie rod end out. Take your tie rod end. I'm going to slide this up into the knuckle. Now if you notice here, we have the hole in our ball joint stud here. We're going to need our replacement cotter pin ready to go for that. Install the nut. Let's go ahead and snug this down. Torque this down to 33 foot-pounds. Once that's torqued, go ahead and take your cotter pin and we're going to go ahead and install it here. Take one of those tabs, bend that over like that. Just tap that down, and then we're going to snip off the excess. Bring your ABS sensor over, feed that in. And get that bolt started. I like to thread these in as far as I can by hand. Snug that down. Once that bolt bottoms out, just give it a little bit more. Go ahead and take your brake rotor. I'm going to line this up. I'm going to go ahead and take a lug nut and I'm going to thread this on. This is going to help keep that brake rotor sitting flush to the hub while we install the caliper and bracket. Go ahead and grab that brake rotor and we're going to rotate this wheel. Now we're going to go ahead and grab our brake caliper, lift it up off of our support hook, spin this Make sure that your brake pads are seated inside the bracket. I'm going to get our upper bolt started here. Once we get that upper bolt started into that caliper bracket, that'll support everything. Make sure you get that in several threads. Go ahead and grab that lower bolt, get that fed in, and get that started a few threads. You might have to pull the caliper in and out a little bit to get that to line up. Now we have our hard line. We'll run this around. I'm gonna get the block installed on the back side here first. Feed that down on that stud. I'm going to install one of the nuts on the back side here to hold that block in place. Pull this around. Push that down. Get that nut installed. And we'll go ahead and snug those down. So once that nut bottoms out, just give it a little bit more. Do want to make sure it's good and snug. Go ahead and do the same for the rear block. Just bottomed out. Now that we have these two nuts installed, let's go ahead and install the third block on the back side of the strut. Grab your ABS wire, line up that grommet with the tab, push that down and in, install the grommet on the back tab, install that one, and this one right here. Snug down our caliper bracket bolts. Let's go ahead and torque these down to 92 foot-pounds. We can now straighten out the wheel and remove that lug nut off the front of the brake rotor. Snug down the upper bolt. Now let's torque this down to 41 foot-pounds. Install two lug nuts side by side. And then we're going to lower the vehicle down close to the ground. Rotate that wheel. I'm going to use our lug nuts here to help us with some leverage. Go ahead and put your pry bar here. I'm going to torque down this axle nut to 92 foot-pounds. Now, our axle nut itself has dimpled edges to work it as a locking nut. You may have a cotter pin on your application. Simply install a new cotter pin, bend it over, snip off the access, remove your pry bar, and remove the lug nuts. At this point here, we can go ahead and raise up the vehicle and install your wheel. Go ahead and install your wheel. I'm going to go ahead and get all of our lug nuts started by hand. Once we get all of these started, we're going to go ahead and snug them down. We have our locking key. Go ahead and torque down your lug nuts to 80 foot-pounds. We're going to use our locking key first. Then we'll continue with the rest in a crisscross pattern. And you're all set.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.